Thank you for joining us for the second session of our Land Connection 2021 conference. I'm Posy MacRae and I head up communications at the Scottish Land Commission. And for this session, we're going to look at the connection between natural capital and a just transition with Chief Executive Hamish Trench. As mentioned in our session earlier today with Mary McCallan, the Minister for Land Reform, and Andrew Finn, natural capital is a rapidly developing area, but one of big potential for Scotland. It is a major theme for the Land Commission and our work. Hamish will explore the opportunities in harnessing this new value to drive a just transition to a net zero economy, but also the risk we need to address so that the market works in the public interest. There'll be a talk by Hamish for 20 minutes, which we have pre-recorded, and then Hamish will be here live to answer your questions. We see the session as lasting approximately 45 minutes, and the discussion will be continued this afternoon looking at how natural capital can deliver community benefit. It'd be great if you could use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to pose your questions, and please feel free to use the chat box to continue the discussion and connect with other attendees. Helping us in the background with all of the tech is Sarah, and she'll be pressing play on the talk in a few moments. I also just need to let you know that this session is being recorded, and that includes a chat section, and will be published in the recording on our YouTube channel. And this is the Land Commission's third Land Reform conference. And over the years we have grown and developed, we'd really like your feedback on the sessions to help shape our future events. So please watch out for a short survey which will be sent out to everyone after the webinar. It'd be great if you could let us know what you think. So now I'd like to introduce Hamish, who'll be exploring the value of land and Scotland's climate change targets and how we can all benefit from natural capital and the land use transformation. So if you could play the video, please, Sarah.
Many thanks for joining us today. As I'm speaking, please feel free to share your own thoughts and questions and discussion using the Q&A function, and I'll respond where I can at the end of the session. Now, we've heard from the Minister this morning a clear message about the importance of land and the government's commitment to an ongoing programme of land reform. Really, I think there are a few better demonstrations of why land and land reform are central to Scotland's success than the climate challenge. Not only is Scotland's land a critical asset and a means of reducing carbon emissions, but how we structure the rights and markets in land are critical to what a net zero economy looks like and to a just transition in getting there. Now, in this session, I want to look at a rapidly developing influence in land ownership and use, the emerging new value associated with carbon and natural capital. The Minister touched on this earlier this morning, and we've not been short of recent headlines about green finance and green lairds. So let's look at what's happening and what it means for Scotland's land and land reform. With our geography and nature, Scotland is well positioned to deliver a land use transformation for net zero. And this is going to involve significantly more woodland cover, extensive peatland restoration, better soil and carbon management, and many associated changes in practice. Delivering this at the pace and scale needed will draw on significant private finance as well as public funding, and there's no shortage of private finance available. Investors and institutions around the world are turning their focus to meeting this societal challenge, which is welcome news. So there's an opportunity here for a win-win, a transformation that benefits nature and people. Our collective challenge, I think, is to do this well, to do it in a way that realises the potential benefits, ensures those benefits are felt by many and used to good effect. In short, of course, this is about making a just transition. Now, in Scotland, we've got the policy framework to do this. As well as a clear articulation of land rights and responsibilities, we've got a clear framework for making a just transition, one in which the costs and benefits of change are shared fairly. The Just Transition Commission set out earlier this year the steps needed. In relation to land, their report recognises that the investment needed to deliver net zero may introduce fresh impetus for reform and a fairer way of managing our land and spreading the benefits widely. It also recognises the central importance of governance arrangements in land, noting that these will need to be reviewed and strengthened as we transition to net zero. So there's no question we're in a decade of change now, and as always, this brings risks and opportunities. What are the things we'll need to address to harness this change well? First, let's look at what we can see developing at the moment in the land market. Much may be uncertain, but there are some things we can see and some fundamental questions raised. It seems clear that much of Scotland's land is finding new forms of value. In particular, some of what we've traditionally called lower quality land, marginal agricultural land and hill ground, may now have new value. Where does this come from? Well, at root, it's the physical potential to deliver increased carbon storage and sequestration, and assumed revenue or value in doing so. Now, to be of value, this needs to have permanence, be additional to the current state, and be guaranteed. So almost by default, the rights to do this essentially run with control of the land in order to be able to deliver it. But it's not quite that simple. In part, there's also anticipation of new revenue flows and future returns through the trading of carbon credits, which may be less tied to the direct ownership of land, but influence its value. And we can already see some businesses and corporate institutions buying land for carbon as a key part of their strategy. For some, this is about offsetting emissions in their own business. Recent high-profile examples being the acquisition of land in the Cairngorms by both Brewdog and Standard Life. Others may be more explicit in looking to secure and trade carbon credits, banking on increasing values. Of course, not everyone wanting to invest or secure carbon credits will want to buy or own land directly. We can also see option agreements, leases, joint venture models emerging. In fact, one of the opportunities I can see in this is the potential for mixed governance models, and I'll come back to this shortly. Now, there's no question that this investment will be much needed in delivering the land use outcomes Scotland's looking for, but there are questions to consider. Firstly, about unintended consequences, and secondly, about how emerging value is used fairly and productively. If Scotland is going to realise the benefits of a just transition, then we'll need to understand the risks and opportunities being created in this emerging market. So let's look at some of the questions I think we need to address. What does this mean for the land market? Rising land values, on top of existing upwards trend, may further price individuals, communities, or tenants out of the market. We're seeing new buyers coming into the land market at scale. Equally, perhaps the potential of future value may encourage existing owners to hold on to land, actually reducing supply and dynamism in land transactions. While there are still uncertainties in valuation approach, it's clear that land is being marketed on the basis of natural capital potential, and that some buyers are prepared to pay significantly more in anticipation of future value. And let's be honest, there are some high values being talked about at the moment, and deals agreed privately that don't come to the market. We need to understand what this means for land ownership, for the motivations for land transactions, and the implications for the overall pattern of ownership. Then the question of who benefits, a question fundamental to a just transition. There's an opportunity here, I think, to ensure that value created is reinvested within Scotland and within local economies. Accepting uncertainties, there is clearly anticipation of future increases in value. Now is the time to be working out a fair and productive approach to how increases in value are shared and used. What is a fair balance between public and private return? How do different parties involved, for example, communities and tenants, participate and benefit? I also think it's right that we ask some big questions. This is about Scotland's economy, not just our land market. In the long term, can our natural capital underpin sustained community wealth? Some countries, of course, have used their fossil fuel resource as a basis for sovereign wealth funds. Is there an opportunity here for an even more virtuous circle? Then there's also the question of who decides. In particular, how are communities engaged in shaping decisions about land use change? Delivering this change at pace and at scale means engagement and building support for change is even more important. There is a risk, I think, that community engagement is seen as a nice to do when faced with the imperative for land use change, but that would be short-sighted. We can, I think, all see that the scale of land use change envisaged over the coming decade is going to need to carry public and community buy-in. Now, we already have clear expectations, guidance, and good practice in engaging communities in land use decisions and must build on this. We also have the piloting of regional land use partnerships, bringing new approaches to decision making and some of the land use choices and collaboration needed. These could, I think, have a really pivotal role to play. And then there's a fundamental question of what it means for our models of land ownership. The implications for different tenure regimes certainly need careful consideration. How, for example, do we ensure those with agricultural tenancies are able to benefit? What is the interaction between landlord and tenant interests in carbon credits and value? Similarly, the implications in a crofting context will need particular consideration. And here's a real opportunity. I suggest investment in natural capital brings the impetus to develop new governance models for our land. Models that bring together the strengths of private, public, and community sectors and build in shared benefit to each. Now, our previous work on governance has shown that Scotland is quite unusual in international terms, in our very siloed definitions of land being held in either private, public, community, or NGO ownership. In many countries, we find these boundaries are blurred in more collaborative models. This isn't unheard of in Scotland. In fact, some of the early community land acquisitions, like Egg or Moidat, were established with collaborative partnership governance arrangements across sectors. It seems time now to revisit these ideas in establishing land ownership structures that are accountable, resilient, and deliver on net zero. And one of our conference sessions on Wednesday will look more closely at the theme of governance models. Let's look for some of the practical opportunities to try doing this. Now, it's worth stepping back sometimes and reminding ourselves that this isn't actually a unique issue for Scotland. Around the world, people are working out how to integrate community rights and empowerment with the drive to net zero. In fact, within the COP26 programme, the FCDO are coordinating sessions on the recognition of community land rights. The international 30 by 30 concept, protecting 30% of the earth for conservation by 2030, has opened up some major international debate about how this is done and the human rights risks of doing it badly. Again, some of the answers are probably there. The international human rights frameworks for governance, land governance, the framing of economic, social and cultural rights have already shaped Scotland's land reform legislation. We can turn to these frameworks again to help guide a just transition. Now, I want to turn now to discuss the work that we at the Land Commission are doing on this. And really now is the time to be shaping this new influence in the market in the public interest. As a first step, evidence and transparency, we're seeking to collate and share a better understanding of relevant land transactions, to understand the scale and nature of transactions involved, and importantly, this will look as far as we can at understanding the level of off-market private sales, as well as the more obvious on-market advertised sales. Starting off early with transparency and a shared evidence base is, I think, going to be important in building understanding of what is and isn't happening. Secondly, we're also reviewing the implications and options for public policy, and particularly in relation to land ownership and how the benefits of new value are shared usefully. We'll be looking at international practice and back to historic experience. For example, we think there are lessons to be learned from the treatment of previous natural resource windfalls, such as oil or gas, or more recently renewables. This work will need to look at the big picture balance of public and private benefit. It seems a reasonable starting point that where value increases as a result of our societal climate challenge, that some of that value is reinvested for public good. This is especially true when the value is underpinned by public investment. We'll also be looking more specifically at options for securing local community benefit. In making a just transition, it's going to be particularly important that the value of our natural resources benefits local communities and economies. Again, particularly relevant with the Community Wealth Building Bill proposed in this Parliament. The purpose of that set out in the programme for government being to enable more local communities and people to own, have a stake in, access and benefit from the wealth our economy generates. Certainly our natural resources should of course help underpin this. Then thirdly, and perhaps most important in the short term, we'll be working with those in practice to shape and support responsible approaches. There's no need to wait for legislation or policy. It's open to us all now to build and deliver on shared expectations for responsible practice. So for example, whether a new owner acquiring land or planning land use change in an existing holding, let's ensure communities are engaged meaningfully before announcements of big land use change are made. More than that, there's no reason we can't already develop shared benefit models. I've talked earlier about the opportunity there now to develop innovative governance arrangements that bring together the strengths of private, public and community interests. I think we can already start to see models developing which source widespread public investment, for example, building on crowdfund or community shares models. It makes sense to look at diversifying investment and benefit together. And I know many in the sector are thinking about the different tenure and governance arrangements, so let's test what will work. We have, of course, in Scotland, a clear framework for responsible practice in land that we can embed in responsible investment. The Land Rights and Responsibility Statement sets out the principles and expectations for responsible land ownership and use, and the balance of public and private interests. We'll be seeking to work with investors as well as landowners and agents to support practical ways of embedding this as a cornerstone of responsible practice. So I think there's much we can do collectively to ensure Scotland really benefits widely from the emerging values associated with carbon and natural capital. And certainly as we take this work forward in the Land Commission over the coming months, we'll be engaging widely to draw knowledge of what's happening on the ground, share and build understanding of the risks and opportunities, and help shape both public policy and practice in this emerging sector. Now, I'd like to close by putting this in a wider land reform context. The influence of carbon and natural capital value in finance in the land market is not an entirely new or unprecedented phenomenon. Over the years, of course, we've seen other resource booms and finance drivers create big changes in the land market, and we can learn from that. It is, though, a very current driver that again reveals the need to modernise our underlying system of land ownership to meet the challenges of today and the coming decades. Unlike many previous resource booms, this one is not extractive in terms of the physical resource. It brings a win-win opportunity to address the climate and nature crises. The third win I think we must ensure is that it's not extractive in social and financial terms, that the value inherent in land is retained and reinvested for common good. In short, that communities across Scotland benefit in a just transition. And of course, we're not addressing this in isolation. There are many levers already in Scotland's programme of land reform that we can look to help manage these risks and realise the opportunities. We have the government's pilot of regional land use partnerships, with potential to bring new governance, accountability and integration to land use decisions. We have parallels in the planning and development sector in current discussions about ways to secure a fair share of land value increases for public good. We have a proposed land reform bill focused on the underlying concentration of land ownership, intended to introduce a form of public interest test in relation to large landholdings. And we have a commitment to community wealth building and to implementing the recommendations of the Just Transition Commission. And of course, we have, in practice, the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, a potentially powerful framework articulating the way the rights and responsibilities associated with land contribute to the public interest and well-being. And the Land Commission's good practice protocols flesh out practical expectations in delivering on this, for example, in community engagement. So let's use the tools we've got already. And I'll finish with two observations on this context. First, over the coming year, government will be engaging on both the review of Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement and a proposed land reform bill, an opportunity to engage in what's needed in both culture change and legislative change in the next steps of land reform. Secondly, there's no need to wait for legislative or policy change. There's much that everyone involved, landowners, agents, investors, communities, can do now to build and deliver on shared expectations, responsible practice, and harness the benefits of a net zero transition. In fact, I think I'd go as far as to say as we can't wait. This is a very visible and rapidly developing influence in the land market. Public interest in it is high. As I see it, we have a shared challenge to manage this well, to build public confidence that while land use change will come at pace and at scale, it will also be fair, that the benefits will be widely felt, and that we're thinking ahead to make the most of what is a shared national resource. So let's find the opportunities to do that.
So yeah, as Hamish said, please submit your questions through the Q&A function and we'll work our way through those. And we already have one in from Nikki Gordon, who's asking, are we considering taxation or other financial mechanisms to drive behaviour change for existing landowners who are not pulling their weight or using land to maximise carbon and biodiversity benefits? So Hamish, what do you think about that?
Yeah, a good question, Nikki. And obviously taxation, I think, is one of the, in some ways, one of the biggest potential levers in influencing change here. So in short, yes, we will of course be considering the role of taxation in amongst the other policy drivers that we're looking at here. The Commission actually is already working on some advice in relation to tax and land. And our initial advice and ideas for government will be published later this year. And in part, that will be looking at kind of a longer term opportunity to improve the way that we tax in relation to land. And I think pretty obviously this whole area of natural capital and increasing value in this area is something that we will need to look at in that work, undoubtedly.
Okay, thanks. So there's sort of two areas that you've kind of talked about there, about so the taxation, and then when you talk possibly about some form of regulation, but how much as well do you think is about behaviour as well?
So as I hope I've kind of set out quite clearly, I think actually there's an awful lot that can be achieved through culture change and responsible practice. And interestingly, when we look actually at some of the investment into natural capital and carbon in the UK, on the whole, it is there is an appetite amongst responsible investors for investment that will be demonstrably responsible and in line with good practice. So I think there is a huge amount that we can do working now between landowners, agents, investors and communities to actually shape what that looks like in practice. I think given how early and rapidly this is moving, there is a job to do at the moment of just building that understanding, that shared understanding of what responsible practice does actually look like. And undoubtedly that can happen perhaps even quicker, and perhaps inevitably quicker than some of the policy or legislative responses that may come in due course.
Okay. A question comes through from Morag Patterson, who's asking about sort of, as you mentioned a few times, it is a rapidly developing area at the moment. There is a significant impact on the land market, and just what advice can you give to communities who are actually being approached about land purchases but don't sort of have the resources or the capacity to be able to respond or to deal with that? What sort of advice would you give to communities at the moment?
Yeah, Morag, I think you're raising an important question there about capacity, which, as we know, is always an issue. And I think it is. There obviously are expectations on land owners, land managers to engage communities, and we're very aware of the capacity implications for communities in making this work as well. So I think the message has to be for everyone involved to try and find the practical ways of doing that, to have the conversations early, so that they're not last minute or rushed or reacting to decisions that have in effect already been made. Really important, I think, that those conversations start early. Then I think there is something perhaps more systemic there as well, and I referred to the potential of regional land use partnerships. I think part of what we need to do collectively in Scotland is actually get those frameworks working much more effectively. So that the choices, the priorities that are being made around land use come into public view much earlier in the decision-making process and give people the chance to engage earlier on.
There's a question in from William around sort of public land and land that's under sort of public sector control. Is it sort of touched on in this morning's session as well with the Minister, and also in quite a few areas of the Commission's work, but what opportunities do you see there with sort of public sector land?
I think in a way, as with all aspects of land reform, actually there's a huge leadership opportunity for publicly owned land, and clearly there is significant land within public ownership. Obviously a big section of that actually is within Forest and Land Scotland ownership, which is obviously very directly relevant to the natural capital opportunities here. So I think huge leadership potential within publicly owned land to help us all get this right, for demonstrating what can work and for sharing that learning with others. And I think, yeah, that does need to be certainly a big part of the development of resourceful practice. I think is working with public landowners as well as private, and indeed NGO and communities right across the sectors.
Thanks. If you, sorry, what was you going to say?
I was just going to say I can also see some questions coming in, kind of more specifically around the role of carbon offsetting and some of the kind of the technical approaches to why people are looking to acquire land at the moment. And I think that I listened to last week actually. I listened to Dieter Helm talking at the Scottish Land and Estates Conference, and I thought really crystal clear message from him. In terms of the offsetting opportunity and the need to do that, as he put it, properly, professionally, and with integrity. And I think that goes to the heart of this. At the moment, this is a very rapidly developing sector. We have heard directly from crofters, from farmers, from land managers, that actually many people are being faced with kind of rapid opportunities emerging, opportunities to perhaps sell carbon rights now, sell early. Yet there's clearly a huge amount of uncertainty and future potential. Many individual land managers will probably need these rights in terms of their own business operation in future, and the values involved, of course, at this stage are really uncertain. So I think there is, at this stage, an issue both of uncertainty and also the need for that offset market to develop with really robust and rigorous measurement and quality assurance mechanisms, which of course are already built into the way that things like the Woodland Carbon Code operate. And I can see that as this develops, the scrutiny of the kind of rigor of offsetting is only going to increase.
There's a question here as well around the sort of the scale of management as well for natural capital, which potentially could tie in with the regional land use partnerships, at looking at things more of a regional level rather than sort of that kind of crosses the boundaries of ownership. How would you see sort of regional land use partnerships and that sort of larger landscape be working with natural capital?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that to really kind of realise the impacts that Scotland wants to on the climate targets, actually as well as the benefits, clearly this needs to be working collaboratively at a landscape scale. We can already, there are already actually some great initiatives working at landscape scale right across Scotland, driven within the community, the NGO, and the private sectors. And these are good examples to build on. I do think that certainly regional land use partnerships offer a kind of more structured long-term way of taking that approach forward, and importantly one that actually embeds that in local democratic control and accountability, and improves the governance and decision making around big landscape scale change. So I think no question that we need to be working on a landscape scale. Actually, I think Scotland can do that well. And really what we can do now is to really make sure that we've got the governance and institutional arrangements right to make sure that happens effectively.
There's a question as well, coming back sort of onto the community aspect of things, from Louise, who's saying about sort of community trust in rural areas. Sort of how does that, again, I suppose it does kind of have a connection about the regional look at things, but how does that tie in with local place plans, and to make sure that that is part of that to help that transition into sort of net zero?
Yeah, and I think a good connection there in terms of local place planning, and clearly land and land reform, I think, has a huge part to play in making the local place planning agenda kind of work and come to life. And really interesting to see that being tried in different places, actually. Fantastic recently to see the Applecross local land use plan come together, something that's embedded within the Highland Council planning framework, to really give that some traction. And I know lots of other communities are taking forward similar opportunities. So I think huge part of it. I think one of the questions actually that kind of is prompted from that, and from Louise's question there, is really about how far does the benefit extend? And I think there's part of this that is about making sure that local communities really do benefit from the resource that's on their doorstep and the natural assets that are on their doorstep. But of course, this needs to benefit communities across Scotland as a whole. So I think that is one of the questions that we'll be looking at in our work. And I suspect one of the questions that we might explore in the panel session after lunch, on the balance between local and national benefit and value, and delivering against both local and national priorities in this.
Also, sort of, as you mentioned, you talk about the role of taxation as well. And I was just wondering, there's a question here from Robert who's asking about sort of the work of the Land Commission and what further engagement we'll be taking on taxation and land values.
So I think in terms of engagement, we'll be engaging kind of widely in this work, from now onwards, and that needs to obviously look at all aspects of this. As I said before, I think taxation is going to be part of the spectrum of options that we look at in terms of the potential policy responses here. It will no doubt, I think, be flagged probably in the initial work that we're doing on taxation this year in terms of areas and why tax is particularly relevant to land reform and unlocking opportunities in this at the moment. I think that the connection makes an interesting parallel really with what we're used to in the more urban planning and development sector. And I think, again, there are lessons that we will want to kind of learn, reflect on in terms of the discussions there. We have already published some advice, for example, in relation to land value capture, in relation to housing and the wider planning and development sector. There are, of course, parallels to thinking through, how essentially the fundamental question of how do we ensure part of the increases in value are actually reinvested and returned for public good.
So a good question has just come in from Adrian as well about the actual sort of arrangements for sharing the land values based on carbon schemes, sort of what sort of sharing arrangements as potentially could be looked at, and also sort of what can we learn from previous experience about those arrangements and how they've worked on being successful or not so successful as well, about sort of previous land use transformations. Yeah.
And I think at this stage, we're keen to look at all potential models and all potential mechanisms for that. I think the important point you raised there in that question is learning from history and experience. So, for example, in the recent kind of renewables age, we have had very defined community benefit mechanisms. So we will certainly want to be looking at those and looking at what are the parallels, what might the equivalent type of approach look like as natural capital develops over the years ahead. What are the lessons from those specific models that we can look at? And likewise, looking further back in terms of the oil and gas sector. And again, I'm sure the panel session will probably get into some different perspectives on this, actually, in terms of the lessons that we might take from that. So I think we will want to look at both the kind of the big picture balance of public and private benefit here, but also opportunities for some quite specific arrangements in relation to local community benefit.
Okay. And we sort of said we've kind of got a session on Wednesday afternoon looking at land governance models in particular. And do you really see? Do you think this is a good opportunity to actually look at land ownership and the current models that are used in Scotland?
Do you think that in a way, both the shift in land use that is driven by climate targets and the new interest in investment that's coming in does give us an opportunity, I think, to rethink some of the governance models involved? So let's look at what different sectors want from the land in this context in relation to a just transition and a net zero transition. There's absolutely no reason in my mind why this couldn't actually result in more mixed governance models, as I said earlier, that actually bring together private investment and in some cases return as well, with community control, with the public interest secured in that mix as well. So as I said, we have sort of done this to some extent in the past in Scotland, but I think particularly when you compare our ownership models with other areas in Northern Europe, we tend to think of things here as being very much, either private or public or community. I really do think this opens up a kind of a slightly different way of looking at that mix, and actually a way of bringing together the kind of interest and investment from different sectors that's going to be needed to make this work.
Actually, just had a good question come in from Neil. I think quite often with natural capital and sort of the discussion, it's sort of seen quite as a rural sort of occasion and happening, and it's only sort of applies to rural land, but actually there's quite a lot of ways that this can apply to urban land as well. So how do you see that happening, and is there sort of potential, say, in our vacant and derelict land that could be pulled through and create an opportunity there?
Yeah, and I think that's a really helpful point to raise, Neil, actually. And actually there are strong connections and parallels across the urban and rural context here. And of course, the Minister this morning referred again to natural capital work in an urban context as well, in terms of urban woodlands and some of the wider work. And I think you only have to look at some of the work that's going on, particularly around Glasgow, in terms of the Clyde area. And within our work on vacant and derelict land over the last couple of years, actually one of the opportunities that has really come to the fore has been the climate agenda and using vacant and derelict sites to deliver on climate action in urban centres. And we can see, I think, in some of the work that we're engaged in at the moment, on the Clyde in particular, and with the Clyde mission, for example, in tackling vacant and derelict sites, I think there are some strong parallels, both in the approach to actually quantifying the potential of land and the financial models involved to unlock some of that, and also, of course, in thinking about benefit and ensuring that that benefit is spread widely amongst communities. So I think increasingly, as we take this work forward, we're certainly aware of those connections across both urban and rural context. And I think that's probably going to be quite a useful area to explore in terms of some of the potential solutions.
You sort of talked a bit about the work of the Commission and what we're going to be doing going forward. There's a question from Peter Peacock about what role do we see the Commission ourselves? Are we sort of a practical facilitator or broker? What sort of role do we play within this arena?
Yep, thanks, Peter. Good question. And I think, as always, we see the Commission doing two things here. One is actually asking the fundamental questions and doing the analysis and research to help inform and advise government in relation to policy and legislation if needed. But the second, equally important and possibly even more important in the short term, is that role in terms of helping shape good practice and responsible practice. So yes, we do intend to work very practically with landowners, agents, communities, investors in understanding what is happening in the market at the moment, understanding the risks and opportunities, and trying to build a shared understanding of them, and really shape what responsible practice looks like. As I say, I think this is a shared challenge that we can all turn to, and indeed all need to turn to now. So a bit of an open call there for people. Please do make contact with us. We are keen to understand real life examples where the opportunities lie, and we'll be very happy to work with partners from all different sectors in terms of actually pulling together and helping support different governance models, different approaches, different responsible approaches to the investments coming in.
And sort of forms part of the good practice work as well, in the good practice programme. Do you see that sort of being a key area, or sort of a main focus for that, or just sort of form part of it?
Yeah, I mean, this will be a big focus. The minister this morning again referred to the importance of the good practice programme in actually, grounding the land rights and responsibilities statement and bringing those principles to life in practice. So I think pretty clearly this is, one of the major focal points and this is one of the major challenges in terms of getting the balance of rights and responsibilities right, actually, in Scottish land use at the moment. So yes, this whole area will be a big focus for our good practice programme, as well as some of our wider policy advice going forward.
So kind of talk just there about the balance of land rights responsibilities, and obviously the natural capital is a massive opportunity for private investment into the country, but how do we make sure that we get that balance right between the private investment and also the public interest, so that the benefits happen to the communities and the local economy?
Yeah, and that question obviously is essentially the fundamental one here. So I think all I would say is that really now is the time to be shaping that actively. I think it's really welcome that the private investment at the level it is available to deliver on these challenges, to deliver on the twin climate and nature and challenges for Scotland. So absolutely, that is welcome, and the government is looking to encourage that private investment into the land use transformation. But now is equally the time to be setting out a clear framework for doing that in a way that's fair and productive and shares the benefit well. So I think that is the fundamental question. There's no question in my mind that now is the time to be shaping that. And as I say, part of this will be about what government does, and no doubt the regulatory framework around natural capital and carbon investment will continue to develop as this market develops rapidly. But it's also about what all of the players within that system do and how we shape that in the meantime.
There's a few areas of work in Parliament that are sort of all happening and coming together at the same time, sort of around the Land Reform Bill, the Human Rights Bill, and also the Agricultural Bill. And there's a question from Emily just about sort of where does this, the revenue sharing, and how does that apply to agriculture? What's being thought about, or sort of what even is the Commission's role within that, and sort of joining everything up and making and seeing whether the subsidy and replacement subsidies angle more towards sort of natural capital, or just how that all sort of ties up together as well.
Yeah, and in making the link to the agricultural context, I think I would draw attention particularly to the role of the Tenant Farming Commissioner. So clearly, when we're looking at some of the specifics of this, how this sector is developing and playing out, as well as the big picture kind of elements that we've talked through, we'll be looking very closely at how this interacts with the tenant farming system. So I think one of the areas that we will want to develop is some clear advice and briefing and shared understanding of the respective rights of landlords and tenants in an agricultural tenanted context. And I think that, as I said earlier, that actually we will need to, collectively certainly need to look at the different sectors, agriculture, crofting and others, to look at how the different parties involved benefit and ensure, I suppose, that there is clarity and ways for all parties involved to benefit. So I think in the shorter term, some of what we will be looking to do at the Commission is actually to share some information, some briefing on some of those basic questions, really basic questions about actually who does own and control carbon, what are the respective interests of different players within the land system that we have, including agricultural tenancies.
Okay, thanks. We're sort of coming towards the end of our time now for the Q&A. This sort of building on that, what you're talking there, just there, Hamish, about the agricultural. There's a question coming from Ross Corbett, just sort of saying about the local food economies and sort of getting that balance right between the natural capital investment, but also making sure that the local food economy is still strong and still able to produce as well. How do you think that's going to be sort of made to get the balance between those two things right as well?
Well, yes, I mean, a very important question about the balance of land use change, and I think one of the opportunities we have, I mean, clearly in Scotland, I think we have actually really good research and analysis capacity in our research institutions that are already turning to this. And I think one of the important things here is going to be the evidence base and actually having that real understanding of the implications of change and land use decisions. And I'll come back, I suppose, to part of this is about getting the governance right. So there will, of course, be lots of competing interests in terms of the land use choices that are made. What's fundamentally important is that those choices are made with good evidence available, but also transparently, and that people are aware of the choices, the prioritisation, and the implications, because there will be trade-offs in this decade of land use transformation. There's no question of that. I think what's important is that those are accountable and transparent. And that's really where we come back to the fundamental questions of getting the governance and decision-making processes and ensuring that people are engaged in that.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for all of your questions and comments. It's been a really sort of informative and engaging discussion as well. And if we didn't manage to get to your question, then please do email sort of info@landcommission.gov.scot and we'll try to answer it as soon as possible. Thanks very much, Hamish, as well for your time today.
Thank you, and I'll just add my thanks to all the everyone participating. Very helpful to see your questions and thoughts as well, and your own views in the chat there. And please do keep engaged with us as we do take this work forward.